Welcome back to Turner Farm. Today we are adding fun inclusions into our sourdough. I'm going to teach you 3 different ways to do this and when they work best. I'm also going to explain when wetter ingredients versus dry ingredients should be added to your dough and demonstrate 2 different ways to do this during the bulk fermentation and then also after the bulk fermentation. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more videos just like this one. So the first way that I'm going to show how to add inclusions into your dough is through lamination. And so we've done probably, 3 coil folds for this dough. And now instead of a coil fold, we're going to laminate it out on the counter. So we're not adding anything to the counter. We're not putting water or flour on the counter. We're just putting the dough. I have a whole video on specifically lamination if you're interested in learning why you do it and how you do it. But I'm going to show you how we do it with adding inclusions in today. So we're just going to put a tiny bit of water on our hands. We're going to come in here and pull the dough. And I like to flip it over only because when we add our inclusions and fold it back up, I want the smooth part to be on the outside. So I'm not going to fully laminate this, but just partially today. I'm just going to come in here and stretch the dough out as much as I can on the counter and sort of as much into like a square as you can. Okay, and so with lamination, you should be able to kind of pick it up, and there's a little bit of a tear there, but you should be able to kind of do like a window pane. So you should be able to see through it without it ripping all over the place. So we're actually doing a cheese inclusion for this one today. So we're gonna do some Parmesan and some cheddar cheese. So we're going to come in here and just add a bunch of cheddar. You don't have to do too much on the outskirts, but we're just adding it in. And you can do this with like any dry inclusion. So you could do it with some chocolate chips, some herbs and spices. I tend not to do wet ingredients or any like fermented ingredients. So like apples can ferment, that sort of thing. I don't want to do that for like during the lamination because we're still going to bulk ferment this and we don't want it to alter the fermentation. So you can do any dry inclusions in your lamination that aren't going to alter the fermentation once we fold it back up and keep bulk fermenting. Okay, so we're going to come in and just fold that over, and then I'm going to do some more cheese along here and then fold this over, and I'll do the rest of the cheese. Not a lot left. And you could come in here with some garlic or, anything else as well. And then we're just going to fold this up. And then the top is on the bottom, so we're going to just kind of fold it over. And when you've added inclusions to your dough, it is going to kind of break through the surface a bit. So that surface tension is altered a little bit, just for a minute. But that's fine. We're just going to do our best to tuck under those edges and kind of make it back into our nice kind of boule looking bulk ferment. And then we're going to put it back into the bowl. And at this point, I tend to limit my coil folds after I've added in all of my inclusions during the lamination. And the reason for that is because I don't want them to poke through the top. I want to keep that nice surface tension. That's why it's important to do this in the middle of the bulk ferment, not at the beginning, because you've already kind of built up some of that gluten and you've developed it enough that you have a surface tension. So we have like quite a bubble right there. I'm not going to pop that, but right underneath it is a whole bunch of cheese. We don't want that cheese to start busting open in our dough. So, you can see there's lots of cheese in there. We're just going to leave this to kind of ferment on its own on the counter for a little bit. And then I will coil fold it maybe a couple more times. And then I will show you what it looks like when we go to shape this as well, because we are going to divide it up into 2 and shape them into our loaves. And I'll show you what that looks like when we're ready to do that. So that's the first way to add inclusions into your dough. You're going to do this with dry inclusions, dry ingredients like herbs and spices, chocolate, cheese, garlic, anything that is not going to alter the fermentation of your dough. So we'll go on to showing you kind of like when to add those types of ingredients in, but this one is a really nice way to just chuck them all in the middle of your bulk ferment and away you go. The second way that we are going to explore adding inclusions is when you are going to shape your loaf. So we're going to pull this out. The difference between adding inclusions at the end and then not is that normally we do a pre-shape. So I would form this into a boule, let it rest, and then I would form it into my either oval or my boule for my bannetons. We don't do the pre-shape with this because we are going to be adding inclusions in. So we kind of want to be able to spread this out. Now I am adding two what seem to be dry ingredients, but I will tell you this. So I'm going to add some cinnamon and I'm going to add some sugar. You don't want to add cinnamon and sugar to the middle of your bulk fermentation. And the reason for that is because cinnamon can actually slow down or change the way that your dough ferments. It can actually even stop it from fermenting altogether in certain parts. And I don't know exactly why that is, but I think it's because if we put it on this, you'll see the dough can't stick to each other. So it tends to kind of like ferment in pockets and then you end up with really gummy dough. Same with sugar. Sugar can also change the way that your dough ferments. It can activate yeast, but it can also change the way that it ferments. So I say that for these two ingredients, I reserve these for the end of the process. It's okay to proof your loaves, but the end of the bulk fermentation is for things like cinnamon and sugar, things like cut up apples or pears or wetter ingredients, dried cranberries, because dried cranberries in the middle of your bulk fermentation can expand and change your ferment. So I like to add these types of things at the end. So we're just going to spread this out and then we're just basically going to sprinkle a little bit of sugar. And so this is sort of like a mini lamination, but we don't want it to get as thin. So we're just letting it kind of spread out, but stay thicker. And we're just going to sprinkle our cinnamon. And I'm actually going to shape this into a oval. So I'm just going to fold that down, but you'll see how the cinnamon doesn't stick to each other. So I'm going to fold that over, and then just like we did for the for our lamination, we're going to do the same thing here. So we're going to add a little bit of ingredients to kind of each layer, and then we're going to fold this over, and I like to fold it over enough that it goes past the cinnamon so that you can kind of pinch it together, because remember, it doesn't really stick to itself. And I'm just going to do a little tiny bit and then just a little sprinkle of sugar, and then we're just going to roll it up. And this is just kind of enough to give it a really fun flavor of cinnamon and sugar. And so it still has lots of kind of structure in there, and I like to pinch those ends up. The trick to inclusions like this is that less is more, because what ends up happening is when this goes into the banneton basket and it sits, that sugar is going to kind of, well, it gets wet, right? So it kind of goes throughout the bread. And if you have too much of it, it starts to peel apart. So like this layer here where I folded it over will start to peel open. And then it's really hard at that point when you have wet sugar. It's almost like syrup. It's hard to then pinch it back together. So less is more with ingredients like cinnamon and sugar. We're not going to see this as like a big swirl in the dough. You're just going to see flecks of cinnamon throughout the bread when you cut into it. And you're going to get that really nice flavor of the sugar and the cinnamon. Just a little bit of a sweetness, and then the cinnamon throughout when you cut into it for your toast, and it's delicious. So that's a second way of putting inclusions in your bread. So we did lamination, and then we did the lamination at the end, which is when we spread it out. So with my recipe, you would divide your dough in half, spread out both sides, and you can do different inclusions for each one. Maybe you do jalapenos and cheddar in one and cinnamon and sugar in the other, and it's a great way to do two different loaves rather than what we did is we stuck the cheese in the lamination, and so both loaves are obviously going to be cheese loaves. So this is a nice way of doing it so that the other loaf that I do from that recipe can be something different. So I did cinnamon and sugar for this one, and we're gonna do one more. I'm gonna show you one more bulk fermentation. How do you add your inclusions into the bulk fermentation? So this has been sitting here, and you'll see, like you can see all the cheese coming to the surface. So I'm just gonna show you quickly how I will coil fold this, because you don't want to manipulate this dough too much once you have the inclusions in it from the lamination. So this is when we put the cheese in. So see, when I start to lift it up, you can really see that cheese kind of coming to the surface, and I'm just going to very gently coil fold this. So it's just allowing the dough to continue to ferment on the counter, and and see, it broke there. So we're just gonna scrape that, try to tuck it under. So it's allowing it to still ferment on the counter and create all of these like ferment bubbles and all of that, but we're still kind of manipulating the dough a little bit because we want to evenly distribute that ferment throughout, and it kind of develops the gluten and builds that inner structure. But we need to be really careful because we don't want that cheese to start pooling out. So you can see how that's happening already underneath. And I don't want that. So I'm just gonna try to tuck that under as best I can. And we don't want that to kind of break open. It's fine underneath for it to do that a little bit. We really don't want to do it on the top, so we can see the cheese starting to kind of open up on the top. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this on the counter. I'm going to let it ferment more, and I'm just going to cover it up and let it ferment. I'm not going to manipulate this anymore. So this is probably the second or third coil fold I've done since the lamination. I'm not going to do any more because you can see like it's starting to get really thin on the top, and the cheese is kind of starting to break through. So we'll cover this, let it do its thing, and then we'll start to shape it, put it in the Benetton basket. So our cinnamon loaf is ready to go into the oven. So you can see it held its shape really nice, but I don't know if you can see this. See how it's peeling apart at the bottom? That's, in short, essentially what sugar and cinnamon will do to your sourdough loaf. It just alters the way that it can ferment, and it tends to pull it apart a little bit. I don't really know how to explain that in scientific terms, but it's just something you want to be mindful of when you're using wet ingredients or ingredients that change your ferment in your sourdough. You don't want to put them in until the end and only let them proof with the ingredients in. And sugar and cinnamon are two of those ingredients. So let's just go in with one easy score. Bring it all the way over there. So you'll see with this one that having inclusions in it for the rest of the bulk fermentation didn't stop it from fermenting at all. In fact, it's quite big and puffy, and probably the cheese helped it do that even more. So obviously, if you're making my master recipe, and I will link the recording to the live class that has the recipe and all that in it. However, if you are making my recipe, usually you have like 2 around 830 gram loaves, but we know that that's obviously not going to be the case today because we have quite a bit of extra weight in these loaves. So it's going to change the bake time, but it's also going to change how much they weigh before we put them into the Benetton baskets. So we're just going to weigh them just to make sure that they're even, and they're not. So these are adding about 100 grams to the loaf, and we're just going to kind of gently pre-shape these. And typically we want to kind of pinch off that top bubble. You just want to be careful with that and make sure that you're finished producing enough surface tension, because once you break that open, the inside is going to be exposed to the outside, and you don't want to keep building surface tension after you've done that because it will start to kind of peel open, and we really don't want that. So I'm just going to gently break that, and we're going to set that aside. And then I'm going to do the same to this one. And there's just lots of activity in this. It had a nice long bulk fermentation. And I like adding cheese in the middle of the bulk ferment as opposed to at the end, mostly because then it's more evenly distributed because we've kind of manipulated the dough after we've put the cheese in. So it's kind of distributed all over the loaf, which is kind of nice because you get a little bit of cheese with every bite type of thing. So we're gonna leave those like that. And then I'm just gonna assess the surface tension of these. If these are not spreading back out as well as I want them to because of the cheese, then I'm probably gonna leave them in a bowl and I'm gonna bake them in a bowl. If I can, I'm gonna try to get them into an oval loaf. I like inclusions in an oval loaf, just personal preference. But what you can find is these will hold its shape more because of the cheese in there. And so if I start flipping it over and trying to manipulate it, we run the risk of like busting open these big bubbles on the top, and I don't really want to kind of mess with that too much. So just be mindful of that. So we're gonna let these rest and then we're gonna make a decision. So I flipped this over and we're just gonna give it a chance. And I'm gonna just show you a really easy, if you have a lot of structure in your loaf, you're not gonna fold this up to build more structure because you don't need to. So what we're gonna just do with this is we're just going to gently fold in the edges, and you almost wanna make it like a triangle so the top is a little bit more narrow than the bottom. And you're just gonna fold it up. And what's gonna end up happening with these types of loaves is you're gonna end up getting more of a swirl type of look, and you might see that a bit after it bakes, but not a lot, especially if you do a proper proof. That will start to take the shape of the Banneton basket, and you won't see that quite as much. So we're just gonna bring over our baskets. And I mean, again, I could easily shape this into a bowl, into a round bowl. I just love these Banneton baskets just so much more than anything else. So I really prefer to use these whenever I can. Okay, so we're just kind of pinching the ends up, and then this will start to fill out. So we're gonna put this in the fridge. It's gonna stay there probably at least 12 hours, and it's gonna fill out the rest of this Banneton basket. So I'm not too worried about that. And a bunch of you are probably gonna yell at me for cutting into this while it's still a little bit hot, but I am gonna do it anyway. So this is what the cinnamon loaf looks like. It had a really nice oven spring, really nice rise. We're just gonna see kind of what the center looks like, and I'm anticipating it's just gonna look like a regular loaf. Yeah, okay, so we have, again, this is way too hot. Don't come at me for that, but I know that this is too hot to cut into and I should have waited, but if you close that back up, it'll be fine. We're not gonna get any gumminess. But you can kind of see a few little swirls with the cinnamon, and it's a little bit darker than it normally is just because that cinnamon is specked through, and it smells insane. This is such a fun inclusion to use in your loaf. It makes a delicious French toast or a nice morning piece of toast. But you can see how it like prohibits the dough from coming together. That is characteristic of your cinnamon. So if we had done a ton of cinnamon, it would have been swirled throughout. And then when you have those kind of strips of cinnamon, the dough isn't going to, it kind of like prohibits it from sticking together. But this is enough, just enough cinnamon for me in this loaf. It's nice and fluffy and has a wonderful crumb, and it's not over or underdeveloped or anything. So, and I love the smell of it. So this will have a really lovely flavor. But that is your cinnamon loaf. So that is adding inclusions at the end of the process. You're gonna get them distributing a little bit unevenly. So we got some over here, some over here. I mean, that's just the nature of how it's going to be if you're putting them in at the very end. Same if we did cheese at the end or chocolate, you're gonna get maybe some clumps of chocolate over here, maybe nothing over here. It just doesn't as evenly distribute the inclusion, but it's still delicious. So you'll see the cheese, it spread into the rest of the Banneton. So that's where it was folded up on the end, and then all you have to do is go in and just pinch it closed, because at this point it's been sitting long enough that it's kind of softened on the top. Same with this one. I kind of did it on this edge, and it will stay together at this point because once it's proofed for long enough, it won't start to peel apart as much anymore if it's done properly. So we're just gonna come in and get these into the oven. So we'll do that one and this one, and I'll just show you kind of what it looks like. You can see the cheese coming through. And I just really like the shredded cheese because it will be so evenly distributed throughout the loaf, like I said before. So we'll pop those into the oven. Sometimes I find they need to bake a little longer. So instead of like, I don't know, 22 minutes for the first half of the bake, I might pop it up to 25 minutes. You can see these coming right out of the oven. They're beautiful and soft and crunchy, and I am cutting into this a little bit early, so it is still a little warm, but I love using grated cheese in my loaves because you'll notice when I open this up how evenly distributed that cheese is throughout the whole thing. So when you take a slice of this and lather it in butter, you're getting the taste of cheese in every single bite, and so I absolutely love doing grated cheese rather than big chunks of cheese when I'm doing this particular inclusion. So the last way of adding inclusions to your sourdough is doing it in the middle of the bulk fermentation. So we did it with the lamination. This has gone through an autolaise and then 2 series of coil folds. And now I'm going to start adding inclusions just right into the dough. And so you can take this out and put it on the counter and spread it out and add them that way, or you can keep it in the bowl and you can just add them on top. So I'm going to go in and do the kind of viral croissant dough that's been kind of going around and circulating. And what I find with that dough is it seems to work best to do this in phases. So we're just going to add a little bit of butter to this coil fold. So we're not adding it all at the same time. So we have about a half a cup of butter, and then I pop this back into the freezer. You want your butter to be nice and cold when you're doing this. And same when you're putting inclusions into this. If you weren't doing butter and you were doing something else, you want your inclusions to be a drier inclusion. So maybe you're doing like herbs and spices and you're adding them in little bits at a time every time you coil fold your dough, because what will happen is you'll coil fold it, you'll let it sit, it's going to spread back out, and then you can add more in. And it just allows you to better distribute the inclusions throughout, because we saw with the cinnamon, if we put them in at the end, it tends to kind of clump. When you do it like this, every time your dough spreads out, you're adding inclusions back in. So I added a little bit of that now. I'm going to let it sit and I'm going to add more. So over the next 2 or 3 coil folds, I will add the butter into the dough and then let it finish its fermentation with all the butter in there. Okay, so we put in another round of the butter, and now this is the last round. So we did it 3 different times. And we just kept it in the fridge in between, because you really want to put in cold butter. And the reason for that, you can even put it in the freezer, but the reason for that is because otherwise it kind of like clumps together, and you really want this to spread out in your dough. So we're just going to come in with our coil fold and just pressing that butter into the bread. And you're going to do this whether this is chocolate or butter or cheese or whatever you're using. This is how you're going to put it into your bread. And as you coil fold it, and you pick it up and kind of move it around, the dough kind of like eats the ingredient that you're putting into it. So right now it's butter. So it kind of just like, even though you're putting it on top, as you coil fold, you're kind of rolling it into the dough, and it's going to distribute evenly throughout the whole thing. So we're just going to let this sit at this point because we've put all the butter into it. So we've used all the butter, and I'm going to let this sit with the cover on to finish its fermentation, and then we'll shape it, put it into the bannetons, do a cold proof. But that is how you do the 3rd variation of inclusions during your bulk fermentation.